For 6 months, Nathan Walker wrote love letters to a woman he had never met under another man's name. Every night, Calvin Mercer would toss him a blank page and grunt, "Just make her want to come." Nathan never meant to fall in love with his own words. He never meant to fall in love with her. When Evelyn Harper finally steps off the stage into Cedar Ridge, Calvin looks her over once and turns his back on her in front of the entire town. Nathan walks forward, instead takes her suitcase from her trembling hand, and says the only true thing he has left. "Every word you fell in love with. I wrote it myself." If you're watching, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart before it heals it. Subscribe now because part 1 is only the beginning. Nathan Walker had never considered himself a man of many words. Out on the range, he spoke maybe 20 sentences a day, most of them to his horse. But at night, alone at the small pine table in his cabin, with a lamp burning low, something in him opened up that never opened up anywhere else. It started as a favor, nothing more. Calvin Mercer had ridden out to Nathan's spread on a cold February evening, dropped a folded newspaper advertisement on the table and said, "I need a wife, Walker. I own the biggest herd in this valley and half the land worth having, and I can't string 2 decent sentences together on paper. You went to school back east. You know how to talk pretty. Write for me." Nathan had almost laughed. "Write your own letters, Calvin." "I tried." Calvin's jaw had tightened with something close to shame, though he'd never have called it that. Woman wrote back asking if I always talked in short, choppy sentences like I was mad at her. "I need this to work, Nathan. I need a wife who can run a house and make me look respectable to the bank when I go asking for that loan on the north pasture. You write me some words that sound like a man with a heart, and I'll pay you for your trouble. $10 a letter." Nathan hadn't needed the $10, but there had been something about the loneliness in Calvin's voice buried under all that arrogance that made him agree. He never once imagined the woman on the other end of those letters would become the reason his own heart started beating differently. Her name was Evelyn Harper, and her first letter had nearly made Nathan set down his pen and never pick it up again. "I have spent the last 4 years caring for my father," she had written, "who lost the use of his legs after a fall from our barn roof, and then slowly lost the use of his mind as well. I do not tell you this so that you will pity me. I tell you this because I believe a marriage built on false pretenses is no marriage at all, and I would rather you know now before you commit yourself to a stranger that I come to you with very little. I have no dowry. I have no family left to speak of. I have only my 2 hands, my faith and a stubborn belief that hard work and honesty are worth more than any inheritance. If that is not enough for you, I understand completely, and I wish you well in finding someone whose circumstances suit you better." Nathan had read that letter 3 times before he answered it. And when he finally sat down to write back as Calvin always as Calvin, he found himself writing something he had never said to another living soul. "Miss Harper," he wrote, "I have found that the men who talk most about their fortunes are usually the poorest men I know, and the men who talk least about their hardships are usually the strongest. You have told me you have little. I would say you have told me you have everything that matters. My mother worked herself thin, raising 4 boys alone after my father passed, and I never once heard her complain of what she lacked. I only ever heard her grateful for what she had. You remind me of her, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." He had signed it Calvin Mercer. His hand had shaken doing it. That was the first lie. It would not be the last, and every one of them would cost him more than the one before. Over the following months, the letters between Nathan and Evelyn deepened into something neither of them had experienced with anyone else. She wrote about the small schoolhouse where she taught before her father's accident forced her to leave that position behind. She wrote about the particular sound of rain on a tin roof and how it made her feel less alone. She wrote about her father's final days when he no longer recognized her face, but still hummed the same hymn every evening, and how she had sat beside his bed and hummed along with him until the very end. "I am not looking for rescue," she wrote once in a letter that Nathan kept folded in his breast pocket for 2 full days before he could bring himself to answer it. I have rescued myself 100 times over these past 4 years. What I am looking for, if I am honest, is simply someone who will not flinch when I tell the truth about who I am." Nathan sat with that letter a long while. Then he wrote back words that were entirely his own, dressed in another man's name. "Miss Harper, I will tell you something I have never told anyone. I do not care one bit what you look like. I do not care if your hands are calloused from work or if your dress is patched at the seams. I have found in this life that beauty fades and fortune disappears. But a person's character is the one thing that only grows stronger with time, like good wood left to season. From your letters, I believe your character is stronger than any I have encountered. I would be a fool to let that pass me by because of anything so shallow as a photograph." He had never asked her for one. Calvin had wanted to. Twice Calvin had told him to request a picture, and twice Nathan had simply not written it into the letter. He told himself it was an oversight. He knew deep down it was because he did not want anything, not her face, not her fortune, not even the truth of who she truly was, to interfere with the connection growing between them on the page. By the 4th month, Nathan Walker knew with a certainty that terrified him that he had fallen in love with a woman under a false name. He tried to stop it. He truly did. He rode out to Calvin's ranch one evening in April, intending to tell him he could no longer write the letters, that Calvin would have to find someone else, or learn to write his own words. But when he arrived, Calvin was standing in his yard, boasting to 2 other ranchers about his bride-to-be, repeating word for word a line Nathan had written about faith and hard work, taking full credit for a heart he had never once put into anything. "She sounds like a fine woman," one of the ranchers said. "She'll do," Calvin said with a shrug that made something in Nathan's chest twist painfully. "Long as she can cook and keep quiet and doesn't cost me anything extra once she's here." Nathan had stood there silent, feeling sick. He should have spoken up then. He knew that later, turning it over and over in his mind on countless sleepless nights. But he told himself it wasn't his place. He told himself Evelyn deserved a comfortable life, a wealthy husband's security after everything she'd endured, and Calvin, whatever his flaws, could give her, that in a way Nathan, with his modest cabin and smaller herd, could not. So he kept writing the letters. And he kept falling deeper into a love that had no name he was allowed to claim. The final letter he wrote as Calvin was the hardest of all. "I look forward to the day you arrive in Cedar Ridge," he wrote, his hand trembling so badly he had to rewrite the line twice. "I believe more than I have believed anything in a long while that meeting you will feel less like meeting a stranger, and more like finally putting a face to someone I have known my whole life." Every word of that was true, just not in the way she would understand it when she read it. Evelyn Harper had buried her father on a gray Tuesday morning in March, and by the following week, she had made the decision that would change the entire course of her life. She was 27 years old with no living family, no husband, no prospects in her small Ohio town, beyond the pitying looks of neighbors who whispered behind gloved hands about poor Evelyn wasting the best years of her life on that sick old man. She had heard those whispers for 4 straight years, and she had learned to walk past them with her chin up and her eyes forward. But that did not mean they had not cut her again and again until she was raw with the wounds of other people's judgment. The advertisement for a mail-order bride in Montana Territory had seemed at first like exactly the kind of desperate measure a desperate woman takes. She had almost thrown the newspaper away twice before she finally sat down and wrote her first letter. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, very little in return. A short, businesslike reply, perhaps. A list of chores expected of her. A statement of what the man wanted in exchange for a roof over her head. What she received instead were words that made her weep alone in her kitchen at 2 a.m. Words so tender and understanding that she began, against every practical instinct she possessed, to fall in love with a man she had never laid eyes on. "You are a fool, Evelyn," she told herself more than once, folding his letters carefully into a wooden box that had once held her father's pocket watch. A grown woman does not fall in love with paper and ink, but she did. God help her, she did. She told her closest friend, Mrs. Abigail Finch, about the letters one evening over tea, and Abigail had frowned with the particular worry of a woman 20 years married and thoroughly disillusioned about romance. "You've never even seen the man's face, Evelyn." "I've seen his heart," Evelyn said quietly. "I believe that matters more. Hearts can be dressed up in pretty words, same as faces can be dressed up in pretty clothes," Abigail warned. "You be careful. Men aren't always what their letters make them out to be." Evelyn had smiled at the time, certain her friend was simply being cautious the way friends are supposed to be. She had no idea how right Abigail would turn out to be, nor how wrong in a way that neither of them could have possibly imagined. The journey to Montana Territory took 11 days by train and stagecoach, 11 days, in which Evelyn read Calvin Mercer's letters so many times the folds had begun to tear. 11 days in which she rehearsed over and over in her mind what she would say when she finally met the man who had written her the words, "I do not care one bit what you look like." She had chosen her plainest traveling dress on purpose, a sensible gray wool, patched neatly at the elbow. Nothing that could be mistaken for vanity. She wanted him to see from the very first moment that she was exactly the honest, unpretentious woman his letters had promised her he wanted. She had no way of knowing that the man waiting for her at the end of that journey had never written a single one of those words with his own intentions in mind. And the man who had written them would be standing off to the side, close enough to watch everything unfold, close enough to feel every second of it, like a blade turning slowly in his chest. Chug! The stagecoach rolled into Cedar Ridge on a bright cloudless afternoon, and half the town had turned out to watch the way small towns always do when there's a spectacle to be had. Evelyn stepped down from the coach with her one traveling case gripped tightly in both hands, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the whole street could hear it. She scanned the gathered faces, searching for the man whose letters she had memorized, whose handwriting she could have picked out from 1,000 others. Calvin Mercer stood near the front of the crowd, arms folded, a toothpick between his teeth, dressed in a fine new coat, clearly purchased for the occasion. Evelyn's breath caught. She had imagined this moment so many times. "Mr. Mercer," she said, taking a small step forward, offering the kind of tentative, hopeful smile a person offers when they are about to meet the person they've fallen in love with through paper and ink. Calvin looked her over. All of her. Slowly, deliberately. The worn hem of her dress, the scuffed toes of her traveling boots, the plain, unadorned bun of her hair showing the first threads of premature gray from years of sleepless nights nursing a dying father. His face changed. "You're Evelyn Harper?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made the smile freeze on her lips. "Yes, sir. You said in your letter you were 27. He interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "I am 27. You look older." He said it flatly, without a trace of apology, the way a man remarks on a horse he's decided not to buy. He turned just slightly to the men standing near him and let out a short, humorless laugh. "I asked for a wife, not somebody's maiden aunt." The crowd, which had been murmuring pleasantly only moments before, went utterly still. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Mercer, I don't understand. Your letters." "My letters said what needed saying to get a woman out here," Calvin said, and something in his voice had turned careless, cruel, the mask of gentility dropping away entirely now that he no longer felt the need to maintain it. "I never once said I'd marry the first plain, worn-out thing that stepped off that coach. I've got standards to keep in this town, Miss Harper. I own the biggest spread in the valley. Folks expect a certain quality in a Mercer bride." "You're rejecting me," Evelyn said, and her voice, though it trembled, did not break. "In front of the whole town, based on nothing but how I look." "I'm being practical," Calvin said, waving a dismissive hand. "You can take the next stage back east, or you can find some other fool out here desperate enough to have you. Either way, this arrangement is off." A ripple of scandalized whispers moved through the gathered crowd. Evelyn heard fragments of it, shameful. Poor thing. Should have known better than to come all this way on a stranger's word, and felt each syllable land against her skin like a slap. She stood there alone, her traveling case still clutched in both hands, her carefully rehearsed words of greeting dying somewhere in her throat. And for one terrible suspended moment, Evelyn Harper felt every single humiliation of the last 4 years collapse down onto her shoulders at once. She had buried her father. She had endured whispers and pity. She had crossed half a continent on the strength of a stranger's tender words. And now that stranger was standing in front of her, laughing at her in front of an entire town. She would not cry. She had promised herself somewhere around the Nebraska border that whatever happened when she arrived, she would not give this town the satisfaction of her tears. She lifted her chin instead and opened her mouth to say something she did not yet know what, when the sound of hoofbeats, fast and urgent, cut through the murmuring crowd. Nathan Walker had been standing at the edge of the gathered onlookers the entire time, close enough to hear every cruel word Calvin spoke, and every one of them had landed in his chest like a fist. He had told himself riding into town that morning that he would simply watch. That he would see Evelyn Harper's face for the first time, confirm with his own eyes that she had arrived safely, and then quietly disappear back to his ranch, having done his part, having kept his distance, the way a decent man keeps his distance from another man's intended bride. But watching Calvin humiliate her, watching him take every word Nathan had poured his own heart into, and twist it into nothing but a means of luring a desperate woman across a continent, only to discard her the moment she failed to meet some shallow standard of beauty. Something inside Nathan simply broke. He was moving before he fully decided to move, striding through the parting crowd, his boots loud against the packed dirt street, his heart pounding harder than it ever had, chasing down a stampeding herd. Evelyn turned at the sound of his approach, her eyes wide, uncertain, braced for one more cruelty, in a day already overflowing with them. Nathan didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He reached down without asking and gently took the traveling case from her white-knuckled grip. "Miss Harper," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried clearly across the silent street. "My name is Nathan Walker. I don't—" Evelyn started, bewildered. "I don't understand. I was told—" "I know what you were told." Nathan glanced just once at Calvin, and something passed between the two men that made Calvin's confident smirk falter for the first time. "And I owe you the truth right here, right now, in front of every person in this town, because you have earned that much and more." He turned back to Evelyn, and when he spoke again, his voice broke just slightly, under the weight of 4 months of buried feeling, finally given permission to surface. "Every letter you received," he said, "every single word that made you believe someone understood you, someone valued your honesty over your circumstances, someone saw your character as worth more than any fortune, I wrote every one of them. Not Calvin. Me." The crowd's murmuring surged again, sharper this time, disbelieving. Evelyn stared at him, her lips parting, her mind struggling to catch up to what he was telling her. You wrote the letters?" "He paid me $10 a letter to make himself sound like a man worth marrying," Nathan said, and there was no anger in his voice toward Calvin now, only a kind of exhausted honesty, the relief of finally setting down a burden he had carried too long in silence. "I told myself at first it was just a favor between neighbors, but somewhere along the way, Miss Harper, I stopped writing his feelings and started writing my own. Every word about your father, about your hands not needing to be soft to be worth holding, about character, mattering more than any photograph that was never Calvin talking. That was me. It's been me since the second letter." Calvin's face had gone a deep, ugly red. "Walker, you shut your mouth." "I've kept quiet long enough," Nathan said, not even turning to look at him. "I let a good woman cross half a country believing she was coming home to a man who never once meant a single word he supposedly sent her. That's on me as much as it's on him, and I won't carry that lie one more day." Evelyn's eyes had filled with tears, despite every promise she'd made herself. But they were not the tears of humiliation she had been fighting back moments earlier. They were something else entirely. Confusion, and underneath the confusion, something achingly close to hope, fighting its way back to the surface. "Why?" she whispered. "Would you do that? Write to a stranger under another man's name, and mean every word?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment, And when he answered, it was as though every other person on that street had simply disappeared. "Because I loved the woman in your letters long before I ever saw your face," he said quietly. "And now that I have seen it, Miss Harper, I find I love her even more." The entire town fell utterly silent. Even Calvin, red-faced and furious, seemed to have no words left to offer. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, an older woman pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. A man removed his hat slowly, as though something sacred had just happened in the middle of that dusty street. A child tugged at his mother's skirt, asking in a too loud whisper what was happening, and was quickly shushed. Evelyn stood frozen, her traveling case now resting in Nathan's steady hand. Her carefully composed dignity trembling on the edge of collapse, not from shame this time, but from the overwhelming, disorienting weight of discovering that the tenderness she had crossed a continent chasing had a different face than she expected, and that the face standing in front of her now was somehow impossibly even kinder than the words on the page had promised. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Nathan told her. "Not today. I know this isn't how either of us imagined this moment. I know I have a great deal of explaining to do, and I know I have no right to expect your forgiveness for the part I played in deceiving you, even if my reasons for writing what I wrote were true. All I ask, Miss Harper, is that you don't get back on that stage today believing you came all this way for nothing." Calvin finally found his voice, stepping forward with the blustering fury of a man who has just watched his authority crumble in public. "This is a disgrace. Walker, you had no right." "I had every right," Nathan said, finally turning to face him, and there was something new in his tone now, something hard and unyielding that the town had never before heard from the quiet Walker boy. "You wanted a wife to make you look respectable to the bank, Calvin. You wanted somebody to cook your meals and keep your house, and never cost you a moment's trouble beyond that. You never wanted her. Not really. Not the woman in those letters. And a woman like that deserves a man who wants all of her, not just the parts that make him look good to his neighbors." The crowd had begun murmuring again, but this time the murmurs carried a different weight, some of quiet approval, some of scandalized judgment, a town suddenly and violently divided over what they had just witnessed. Calvin's eyes swept the crowd, seeing perhaps for the first time how thoroughly he had exposed himself. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he spat, "Fine. Take her, Walker. See how long it takes before her fine character wears thin out on that scrap of land you call a ranch." He turned on his heel and stalked off through the parting crowd, his fine new coat suddenly looking a great deal less impressive than it had an hour before. Evelyn watched him go, and then turned back to Nathan, still struggling to steady her breathing, still struggling to understand the impossible turn her life had just taken in the space of a few short minutes. "I have a ranch," Nathan said quietly before she could ask the question hovering behind her eyes. "It's smaller than Calvin's. It's harder work, and it won't make you the wife of the richest man in the valley. But I meant every word I ever wrote you, Miss Harper, and I intend to keep meaning them for as long as you'll let me." Evelyn looked down at her traveling case still resting in his hand, and then back up at his face, the face behind the words that had carried her through the darkest years of her life. The face she had crossed a continent to find without ever knowing it belonged to someone else entirely. "I came here," she said slowly, "believing I was traveling toward a man who valued honesty above everything else." "You were," Nathan said. "You just didn't know his name yet." For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing at all. The whole street seemed to hold its breath along with her waiting. Then finally quietly she said, "I don't know if I can trust a man who let a lie carry me 2,000 miles, Mr. Walker. Even if that lie was wrapped around a truth." Nathan's face fell just slightly, but he nodded, accepting the wound of her words without flinching from them. "That's fair. That's more than fair. I don't expect you to forgive that easily, and I won't ask you to." "But," Evelyn continued, and something in her voice shifted, softened, "I also don't know if I can simply walk away from the only honest words anyone has offered me in 4 long years, even if I only just learned who truly wrote them." She held out her hand, not for the traveling case, but simply to be held, and Nathan took it as though it were the most fragile and precious thing he had ever touched. "30 days," she said. "You give me 30 days on your ranch, Mr. Walker, to decide for myself who you truly are beneath all those letters, the honest man they promised, or one more disappointment, wearing a kinder mask. And if at the end of those 30 days I still wish to leave, you will not stand in my way." "You have my word," Nathan said, and this time for the first time in 6 long months. Every word between them belonged entirely to him. Behind them, the crowd remained silent, still absorbing what they had witnessed. A rejection turned in the space of a few extraordinary minutes into something neither humiliation nor triumph, but the fragile, trembling beginning of something neither Nathan Walker nor Evelyn Harper yet understood the true shape of. Neither of them noticed Calvin Mercer standing at the corner of the Mercantile, watching them walk together toward the edge of town. His face twisted with a fury that would not fade quietly. A fury that would, in the months to come, reach far beyond wounded pride and threaten to destroy everything the two of them were only just beginning to build. The ride to Nathan's ranch took the better part of an hour, and for the first 20 minutes of it, neither of them said a single word. Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her traveling case wedged between her feet, as though she still half expected to need it for a quick escape. She kept stealing glances at him from the corner of her eye, at the strong, weathered hands holding the reins, at the set of his jaw, at the quiet way he seemed to carry the weight of everything he'd just confessed in front of the whole town. Finally, she couldn't hold the question in any longer. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Before I got on that stage. Before I crossed half a country believing you were coming to marry Calvin Mercer." Nathan finished for her, and the shame in his voice was so plain it startled her. "I ask myself that same question every hour, Miss Harper. I don't have a good answer for you. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I told myself you'd have a better life with his money and his land than you'd ever have with mine. That wasn't your decision to make," Evelyn said, sharper than she intended. "No," Nathan agreed quietly. "It wasn't, and I'm sorry for it. I'm not going to sit here and make excuses for myself. I had 100 chances to tell you the truth in those letters, and I let every single one of them pass because I was a coward about my own feelings." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. There was something almost unbearable about the honesty in his voice, no flourish to it, no attempt to soften the blow or paint himself in a better light. Just plain, unguarded truth, exactly the kind she had begged for in every letter she'd ever sent him. "You could tell me anything right now," she said slowly, "and dress it up however you liked. I'd have no way of knowing the difference." "I know that," Nathan said. "That's exactly why I'm not going to." Something in her chest loosened just slightly at that. They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the one they'd started, with less brittle, less guarded. When the ranch finally came into view, Evelyn sat up a little straighter, taking it in. It was smaller than she'd expected, a modest cabin with a barn and a scattering of outbuildings' fences that had clearly been mended more than once, a herd grazing in the distance that was respectable, but nowhere near the size of what Calvin Mercer had boasted about. "It isn't much," Nathan said, watching her face carefully. "It's honest," Evelyn said. "That's more than I got from the other one." A young ranch hand came jogging out from the barn as they pulled up, a lanky boy of maybe 17, with a shock of red hair and dirt on his knees. He skidded to a stop, staring at Evelyn with unabashed curiosity. "Boss, is this—" "Tommy, this is Miss Harper," Nathan said, climbing down and coming around to help Evelyn from the wagon. "She'll be staying with us a while. Miss Harper, this is Tommy Briggs. He and his brother Eli work the ranch with me." "Ma'am," Tommy said, snatching his hat off his head so fast it nearly fell in the dirt. "Didn't nobody tell us we were getting company?" "Neither did I, apparently," Evelyn murmured, and Nathan had the grace to look uncomfortable. "There wasn't exactly time to send word ahead," he admitted. Tommy's eyes went wide with sudden understanding. "Wait, this is the letter lady, the one Calvin Mercer was supposed to—" "Tommy," Nathan said, a warning edge in his voice. "Sorry, boss." But the boy was grinning now, glancing between Nathan and Evelyn with the transparent delight of someone who has just realized he's about to witness something far more interesting than herding cattle. "I'll go tell Eli to set another place at supper." He took off toward the barn at a run, and Evelyn watched him go with the ghost of a smile finally touching her lips for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. "He's young," Nathan said, almost apologetic. "He's honest too," Evelyn said. "Must run in the water out here." That first evening, over a simple supper of beans and cornbread that Nathan cooked himself with more determination than skill, Evelyn laid out the terms of her stay in a voice that left no room for argument. "I won't be a guest in this house," she said, setting down her fork. "I won't sit idle while you and your men work yourselves ragged and then expect me to simply appear at supper looking presentable. If I'm to spend 30 days here deciding whether I can trust you, Mr. Walker, I intend to earn my place every single one of those days." Nathan blinked at her. "Miss Harper, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. There's a difference, and I'd ask you to respect it." Something flickered across Nathan's face, surprise, and underneath the surprise, something that looked almost like admiration. "All right," he said slowly. "What did you have in mind?" "Your books," Evelyn said. "The ranch ledgers. I saw the state of them when I passed by your office receipts stuffed in with letters, no columns, no order to any of it. I kept my father's affairs in perfect order for 4 years with half the resources you have here. Let me organize them properly. That's not exactly what a man expects to hear from his houseguest." "I'm not your houseguest," Evelyn reminded him, and there was steel in it now, the same steel that had kept her standing upright in the middle of a humiliating street just hours before. "I told you, 30 days. I intend to use every one of them wisely." Nathan studied her for a long moment, and then slowly a genuine smile broke across his face, the first Evelyn had seen from him since he'd taken her suitcase in the street. "All right, Miss Harper," he said. "The ledgers are yours." She started the very next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline spreading Nathan's tangled records across the kitchen table, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent years imposing order on chaos. Tommy and Eli watched her from the doorway with open fascination, whispering to each other until Nathan sent them off to the north pasture with a look that needed no words. By midday, she had sorted 8 months of receipts into neat columns. By evening, she had found an error in Nathan's accounting that had cost him nearly $30 over the winter, a miscounted shipment of feed that he'd paid for twice without ever noticing. "$30? Nathan said, staring at the numbers she'd laid out for him, genuinely stunned. "I've been bleeding money and didn't even know it." "Most men don't," Evelyn said. "Numbers don't lie the way people sometimes do. You just have to be willing to look at them honestly." Nathan glanced up at her, and there was something loaded in the silence that followed something neither of them quite knew how to address yet. Evelyn cleared her throat and looked back down at the ledger, and the moment passed, though it left a warmth behind that neither of them mentioned. That night, lying awake in the small room, Nathan had given up for her use, sleeping instead in the barn loft himself. Without a word of complaint, Evelyn found herself thinking not of Calvin Mercer's cruelty in the street, but of the quiet, steady way Nathan Walker had looked at her ledgers, and at her, as though both were worth taking seriously. She told herself it meant nothing. She was already beginning to suspect that was a lie. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Evelyn rose before dawn each morning, moving through the ranch with a quiet purpose that seemed to reorganize everything it touched. She finished the ledgers within the first week, and rather than stopping there, she turned her attention outward to the 2 ranch hands who could barely read the labels on their own feed sacks. "Tommy," she said one evening, catching the boy squinting hard at a supply order Nathan had left for him, his lips moving silently as he tried and failed to make sense of the words. "Can you read that?" Tommy's ears went red. "Well enough," he mumbled, which both of them understood to mean not at all. "How would you feel about lessons?" Evelyn asked. "After supper, an hour, maybe less. I taught school for years before I came out here." "I'm 17, ma'am," Tommy said, mortified. Bit old for schooling. You're never too old to stop being ashamed of what you don't yet know, Evelyn said gently. You're only too old once you decide you'd rather stay ignorant than feel embarrassed learning. Tommy stared at her for a long moment, and something in her steady matter-of-fact kindness seemed to loosen something tight in his chest. Eli can't read much better, he admitted quietly. Never wanted nobody to know. Then we'll start with both of you, Evelyn said, and no one outside this house needs to know a thing about it. By the second week, both Briggs brothers were spelling out full sentences by lamplight at the kitchen table, each evening, their pencils gripped with fierce concentration, Evelyn's patient voice guiding them through words they'd spent their whole lives pretending to understand. Nathan watched from the doorway, some nights saying nothing, but the look on his face was one Evelyn caught more than once, and pretended not to notice a look of something far deeper than simple gratitude. Can I? It was in the third week that the real trouble started to surface, though none of them recognized it yet for what it was. A widow from the neighboring property, Mrs. Louisa Grant, arrived at the ranch one afternoon in visible distress. Her eyes red-rimmed, a crumpled letter clutched in one shaking hand. Mr. Walker, she said. I'm sorry to intrude. I know you've got your own troubles to attend to, but I didn't know where else to turn. What's happened, Mrs. Grant? Nathan asked, coming out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. It's my son, out in California. He wrote asking after his father's affairs, and I don't... Her voice cracked. I don't know how to write him back proper. I never learned my letters well, not like my husband did, and I'm afraid if I don't answer him right, he'll think I don't want him coming home. Evelyn stepped forward before Nathan could respond, her voice gentle but sure. Mrs. Grant, would you like some help? I'd be glad to sit with you and write whatever you'd like to say, in your own words. I'll only help with the letters, not the feeling behind them. That part's entirely yours. Mrs. Grant's face crumpled with relief, so raw it was almost painful to witness. Would you truly? I wouldn't want to be any trouble. It's no trouble at all, Evelyn said, already guiding the older woman toward the porch steps. Come sit. Tell me what's in your heart, and I'll help you find the words for it. Nathan watched the two women settle onto the porch together, watched Evelyn lean in close, listening with total attention as Mrs. Grant haltingly began to speak of her son, her grief, her fear of dying alone on a ranch too big for one aging widow to manage. Something shifted in Nathan's chest that afternoon, watching Evelyn Harper offer this small, unglamorous kindness to a woman who had nothing to give her in return. I had been searching for a wife he thought standing frozen in the yard with the rag still in his hands. I think I might have found something far more valuable than that. Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge the way word always does in small towns, though it spread in two very different directions at once. Among the ordinary folk, the widows, the ranch hands, the struggling families scattered across the valley, word spread that the rejected mail-order bride had turned out to be a woman of remarkable kindness and skill, teaching children their letters, helping widows write to distant sons, quietly mending the small invisible wounds of a hard frontier community. Among a different sort of folk, the word that spread was uglier. Calvin Mercer had not taken his public humiliation quietly. She humiliated me. He told anyone who would listen at the saloon, his voice thick with whiskey and wounded pride. Standing there in that street letting Walker make a fool of me in front of the whole town. You think that woman's some kind of saint? She played her hand well, I'll give her that. Latched onto a fool with a small ranch the second I saw her for what she really was. What's that supposed to mean, Calvin? One of the other ranchers asked. Means a woman desperate enough to answer a stranger's advertisement from 2,000 miles away isn't exactly the picture of virtue folks are painting her as, Calvin said, his eyes glinting with malice. Means maybe there's a reason a woman like that never married back home. Maybe there's a reason her own family didn't want her around. It was cruel, and it was baseless, and it spread anyway, the way ugly rumors always spread faster and stickier than kind truths. Evelyn heard the first whispers of it 3 days later, standing outside the general store, while the shopkeeper's wife pointedly avoided meeting her eyes. Something wrong, Mrs. Callahan? Evelyn asked, setting her small purchases on the counter. No, nothing, the woman said too quickly, counting out change with unusual concentration. Just, I heard some talk is all, about your circumstances back east. None of my business, of course. Evelyn's stomach tightened. What kind of talk? Just talk, Mrs. Callahan said, refusing to elaborate further, and Evelyn walked out of that store with a cold, familiar dread settling over her. The particular suffocating dread of a woman who has spent years being whispered about and recognizes instantly when it's starting up again. She told Nathan about it that evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table long after Tommy and Eli had gone to their bunks. Calvin's spreading lies about me, she said, her voice carefully controlled, implying there's some shameful reason I answered a stranger's advertisement, implying my own family didn't want me. Nathan's jaw went tight. That son of a... Don't, Evelyn said quietly. Getting angry won't undo what he's already put into people's mouths. I've dealt with whispers before, Mr. Walker. I know how to survive them. You shouldn't have to survive them, Nathan said. Not because of me. Not because I... This isn't about you, Evelyn said firmly. This is about a small man who can't stand having his cruelty exposed, looking for any way to make himself feel powerful again. I won't give him the satisfaction of seeing it work. But that night alone in her room, Evelyn allowed herself just for a moment to feel the full weight of it, the exhaustion of once again being someone's convenient target, the fear that no matter how far she traveled, no matter how completely she reinvented her circumstances, there would always be someone waiting to tear her back down. She thought of her father in his last lucid months, gripping her hand with surprising strength, and telling her, Evelyn, the world will always have people eager to make you small. Your only defense is refusing to let them succeed. She fell asleep repeating those words like a prayer. The fourth week brought a new crisis entirely, one that had nothing to do with rumors and everything to do with the land itself. The rain that should have come in early summer simply didn't. Day after day, the sky stretched clear and merciless overhead, and the creek that fed half the valley's ranches began slowly and then alarmingly to shrink. How bad is it? Evelyn asked, watching Nathan return from the creek one evening, his face grim with worry he was clearly trying to hide. Bad, he admitted. If it doesn't rain soon, we'll be hauling water for the herd within the month. Half the ranchers in the valley are in the same position. What happens if it doesn't rain? Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then men start looking for someone to blame for their troubles, he said. And in a valley this small, with tempers already running high over other things, that's a dangerous thing to have brewing. Evelyn understood without needing him to spell it out further exactly what, or rather who, he meant. The drought worsened through the following weeks, turning green pasture brittle and brown, forcing ranchers across the valley into increasingly desperate measures. Wells that had run steady for a decade began sputtering dry. Cattle grew thin and restless. And exactly as Nathan had predicted, tempers grew short, right alongside the shrinking water supply. It was during this tense, brittle stretch that Calvin Mercer saw his opportunity and seized it with both hands. Nathan's ranch, unlike most others in the valley, drew water from a spring-fed source higher on the ridge, one that had been running steady even as the creek below dwindled to a trickle. It was an old water right, established by Nathan's father decades before, uncontested and undisputed for as long as anyone could remember. Until now. Walker's hoarding water while the rest of us dry up, Calvin announced at a hastily called meeting of ranchers in the back room of the saloon, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who has found the perfect lie to fit a desperate audience. That spring feeds half the runoff this valley depends on, and he's been letting it flow straight onto his own land while the rest of us watch our herds waste away. That's not true, one of the older ranchers said uncertainly. Nathan's water right goes back to his father's time. Ain't nothing new about it. Maybe it's time somebody looked at whether that right still makes sense, Calvin pressed. Times are different now. Desperate times, gentlemen, Are we going to let one man and his—" He paused deliberately, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "House guest, keep the rest of us thirsting while his ranch stays green as springtime." The room erupted into uneasy murmuring exactly as Calvin had intended. Word reached Nathan within hours, carried by Tommy, who'd overheard it secondhand at the mercantile and come racing back to the ranch, breathless with alarm. "They're saying you stole the water, boss," Tommy said. "Saying it ain't fair you've got a full spring while everybody else is drying up. That water right's been in my family for 30 years. Nathan said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Calvin knows that better than anybody. He's just looking for an excuse to hurt me, and he's using a drought to do it." "What are you gonna do?" Tommy asked. Nathan didn't have an answer. Not yet. Evelyn found him an hour later standing alone at the edge of the dwindling creek, staring out at the cracked, sun-baked mud where clear water used to run. "They're going to try to take the ranch, aren't they?" she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. It wasn't really a question. "Calvin's going to try," Nathan said. "Whether the county lets him succeed is another matter. But even if he loses the legal fight, he can do plenty of damage stirring up the town against us in the meantime. Enough damage that it might not matter who technically wins." "Then we don't let him stir up the town," Evelyn said. Nathan glanced at her. "How exactly do you propose we manage that I can't force people to see reason when they're scared and thirsty?" "No," Evelyn agreed. "But scared, thirsty people don't need reasoned arguments nearly as much as they need someone showing up to help them when it matters. Calvin's spending all his energy tearing people down to build himself up. We should be spending ours doing the opposite." "What did you have in mind?" Evelyn's expression had taken on the same steady, unshakable determination Nathan had first glimpsed in her the moment she stood her ground in the middle of a humiliating street. "I'm going to open your barn to the whole valley," she said. "Not for cattle, for people. The children whose schoolhouse is drying up along with everything else because the teacher moved on last spring. The families running short on food while their crops fail. If Calvin wants to spend this drought spreading fear and blame, let him. I intend to spend it proving exactly the opposite of every ugly thing he said about me." Nathan stared at her for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring behind his eyes. "You don't have to fight this battle," he said quietly. "It's not yours." "It became mine," Evelyn said, "the moment you took my suitcase in that street and told the truth in front of the whole town, knowing exactly what it would cost you. I don't run from fights that matter, Mr. Walker. I never have." The following morning, Evelyn set to work with an energy that left even Tommy and Eli struggling to keep pace with her. She cleared out the unused half of Nathan's barn, sweeping it clean, arranging bales of hay into makeshift seating. Hanging an old chalkboard she'd found stored away in the loft remnants, Nathan explained of a small school his mother had once tried to start for the ranch children before illness took her too soon. Within 3 days, word had spread through the valley that Evelyn Harper was holding lessons for any child whose family could no longer manage the trip to the shuttered schoolhouse in town. Within a week, more than a dozen children were arriving each morning, some walking miles across drought-cracked land, eager for even an hour of normalcy in the middle of so much uncertainty. "You're good with them," Nathan said one afternoon, watching her patiently guide a small girl through her letters, the same steady patience she'd shown Tommy and Eli weeks before. "I taught for 6 years before my father's accident," Evelyn said. "I missed it more than I ever let myself admit." "Why'd you stop?" "He needed me," Evelyn said simply. "And there wasn't anyone else to need him instead." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard kind of love. Giving up something you're good at, something that clearly matters to you because someone else needs you more." "It's the only kind of love I've ever really known how to give," Evelyn said. And something in her voice made Nathan's chest ache in a way he didn't quite have words for yet. Even as the makeshift schoolhouse in the barn brought a measure of hope to the valley's children, the water crisis outside continued to worsen, and Calvin Mercer continued patiently and relentlessly to twist that desperation to his advantage. He brought a formal complaint before the county land office demanding a review of Nathan's water rights, dressing his personal vendetta up in the language of community welfare. He pressured the mercantile owner, a man deeply in debt to Calvin, for a loan extended the previous winter, into quietly refusing to extend Nathan any further credit. "I'm sorry, Nathan," the shopkeeper said, unable to meet his eyes. "Times are hard for everybody right now. I can't afford to carry accounts I might not see paid." "You've carried my account for 6 years without trouble, Sam," Nathan said. "What's really going on here?" Sam's silence told him everything Calvin had wanted him to know. It was a slow, deliberate strangling, not dramatic enough for Nathan to fight directly, but steady and merciless enough to threaten everything he'd built. Credit dried up. Neighbors who had once waved warmly now looked away. The county scheduled a hearing on the water rights dispute for early autumn, and rumors swirled that Calvin had already spoken privately with the land commissioner, a man known to owe Calvin's family more than one favor. "He's going to win, isn't he?" Evelyn said one evening, watching Nathan pore over paperwork by lamplight, his exhaustion plain on his face. "Not because he's right, because he's powerful enough to make being wrong not matter." "Maybe," Nathan admitted. "I don't know anymore. I've never had to fight a man with that much money and that much spite behind him." Evelyn reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a small, simple gesture that startled them both with the warmth it carried. "Then we'll find another way to win," she said quietly. "One he doesn't know how to fight." Nathan looked down at her hand resting over his, and then up at her face, and for a long suspended moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with everything they had both been carefully, deliberately not saying since the day she'd stepped off that stagecoach. "Evelyn," Nathan said softly, her given name for the first time, without the formal distance of Miss Harper wrapped around it. "Nathan," she answered just as softly, and something in the way she said it told him she'd noticed the shift too, and welcomed it. Outside, the drought-dry wind rattled against the window pane, and somewhere out in the darkness closer than either of them, yet realized Calvin Mercer was already setting the next piece of his plan into motion. A plan that would strike not at Nathan's water rights, or his ledgers, or his standing in town, but at the one thing Nathan Walker had never expected anyone to be cruel enough to touch. The letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a writer Evelyn didn't recognize, and the moment Nathan read the return address, every trace of color drained from his face. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, watching him stand frozen in the yard, with the envelope trembling in his hand. "It's from Ohio," Nathan said slowly. "It's addressed to you." Evelyn's stomach dropped. She hadn't given anyone in Cedar Ridge permission to know where she'd come from beyond the vague details in Calvin's public accusations. "Who would be writing me from Ohio?" Nathan handed it over without a word, and Evelyn broke the seal with hands that weren't quite steady. She read it once, then again, her breath growing shorter each time. "Evelyn," Nathan said, watching her face go pale. "What's wrong?" "It's from my father's solicitor," she whispered, "the one who handled his affairs after he died. Someone wrote to him. Someone in this town wrote to Ohio asking questions about my father's death, about debts he might have left behind, about—" She broke off, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Someone is trying to prove I left Ohio running from something shameful. Debts, scandal, anything they could find to make the rumors true." "Calvin," Nathan said, his voice going hard and cold. "The solicitor says he answered the letter honestly." Evelyn continued, scanning further down the page. "Said there were no debts, no scandal, nothing but a devoted daughter and a difficult, expensive illness. But he also says—" She stopped again, her voice catching. "Says what?" "He says the person asking wasn't interested in the truth. He says they asked very specific questions. Questions designed to be twisted no matter what answer came back." Evelyn lowered the letter, her eyes bright with a mixture of fury and hurt. "Calvin isn't just spreading rumors anymore, Nathan. He's manufacturing them. He's reaching 2,000 miles across this country to find something, anything he can use against me." Nathan took the letter from her shaking hands and read it himself, his jaw tightening with every line. "This isn't wounded pride anymore," he said quietly. "This is a man willing to destroy an innocent woman's reputation rather than admit he was wrong about her for even a moment. "What do we do?" "We don't let him see it worked," Nathan said. "That's what we do. We keep doing exactly what we've been doing, and we let this valley see the truth of who you are with their own eyes, not through whatever poison Calvin manages to pour into their ears." But that night alone, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the full suffocating weight of it. The realization that a man with money and standing could reach clear across the country to hunt for ways to destroy her, simply because she had dared to build a life he hadn't approved of. She thought again of her father's words. "The world will always have people eager to make you small." She had never imagined the effort some people would go to in order to succeed at it. The water rights hearing loomed over the following weeks like a storm that refused to break, and the drought outside worsened right alongside the mounting tension, as though the land itself were somehow keeping pace with the cruelty spreading through the valley. Calvin, emboldened by the county land office's apparent willingness to entertain his complaint, grew bolder still. He began quietly buying up the debts of smaller ranchers, struggling through the dry season, positioning himself rancher by rancher as a man whose goodwill they could scarcely afford to lose. "He's building himself an army," Nathan said grimly, going over the situation with Evelyn one evening after the children had gone home from their barn schoolroom. "Every rancher he helps through this drought becomes a rancher who owes him a favor when it comes time to vote at that hearing." "Can they even vote on a water right?" Evelyn asked. "Not directly," Nathan admitted. "But the land commissioners and elected men listen close to what the loudest, wealthiest voices in a room have to say. If enough ranchers stand up at that hearing and say, 'My spring ought to be shared out dressed up as fairness during a drought,' the commissioner's going to feel plenty of pressure to rule against 30 years of established rights." "Then we need voices of our own," Evelyn said. "Who's half this valley's already scared enough of losing everything that they'll say whatever Calvin tells them to say." "Not the ones we've helped," Evelyn said quietly. "Mrs. Grant, the families whose children learn their letters in your barn every morning. The ones who've watched exactly what kind of man you are these past weeks with their own eyes, not through Calvin's version of events." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "You really think that's enough to stand against a man like Calvin Mercer?" "I think character shown consistently day after day is harder to argue against than character merely claimed," Evelyn said. "Calvin's spent his whole life telling people who he is. We've spent this whole drought showing them." It was 2 days after that conversation that the wildfire started. It began as such things often did during a dry season, from something small and careless, a cook fire left untended on a neighboring property, a sudden gust of wind carrying an ember into brittle drought-dead grass. By the time anyone in Cedar Ridge noticed the smoke rising on the horizon, the fire had already grown into something the whole valley could see, a churning gray column climbing into the clear summer sky. "Nathan!" Tommy came sprinting from the direction of the ridge, his face white with alarm. "Fire's caught out past the Hendricks place. Wind's driving it this way fast." Nathan was moving before the boy even finished speaking, shouting orders to Eli, grabbing shovels and wet sacking from the barn, his mind already racing through the terrible arithmetic of which direction the fire would run, which properties lay in its path, how much time they might have before it reached anything that mattered. "The Hendricks place is right next to Mrs. Grant's land," Evelyn said, her voice tight with sudden fear. "She's alone out there, Nathan. She can't fight a fire by herself." "I know," Nathan said grimly, already swinging up onto his horse. "I'm riding for her now. Evelyn, I need you to ride into town. Tell everyone you can find. We need every hand and every wagon of water this valley can spare, and we need them now." "What about the children? Send them home first, quickly, then go," Nathan said. "This fire won't wait for anybody's convenience." For one terrible suspended moment, Evelyn hesitated, gripped by the fear of watching Nathan ride directly toward danger she couldn't follow him into. Then she saw the same fierce, unwavering resolve in his eyes that she recognized from her own reflection in difficult moments, and she nodded, already turning to gather the frightened children scattered across the yard. "Go," she said. "I'll handle everything here. Just come back." "I intend to," Nathan said. And then he was gone, his horse thundering toward the rising smoke. See, what followed was the longest afternoon of Evelyn Harper's life. She sent the children running for home with urgent instructions to warn their families, then turned her own wagon toward Cedar Ridge, driving harder than she'd ever driven anything in her life. Her heart hammering with fear for Nathan, and fierce determination not to let that fear paralyze her. She burst into the center of town shouting the alarm before she'd even brought the wagon to a full stop. Fire out, past the Hendricks place, driving toward the Grant property. We need every hand, every wagon, every barrel of water this town can spare. The response was immediate and chaotic. Men shouting, women running for buckets and blankets, wagons being hitched with frantic haste. In the middle of the commotion, Evelyn spotted Calvin Mercer standing near the saloon, watching the panic unfold with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Calvin!" she called, striding directly toward him despite everything between them. "Your ranch hands, however many you can spare. We need them now. This isn't about water rights or old grudges. This is people's homes and lives." For a long moment, Calvin simply stared at her, and Evelyn braced herself for refusal, for one more cruelty layered onto everything else he'd already inflicted. Then, to her genuine surprise, something shifted in his expression. "Jenkins Cooper," he barked at two men nearby, "get every hand from my place out to the Grant property now. Bring every water barrel we've got." "Thank you," Evelyn said, startled. "Don't thank me," Calvin said gruffly, not quite meeting her eyes. "Fire doesn't care about grudges. Neither do I, not when it comes to this." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "Go on. Get back out there. I'll see the town organizes what it can." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even kindness, not really. But it was... Evelyn realized as she climbed back into her wagon, the first crack she'd seen in Calvin Mercer's carefully maintained cruelty proof, that somewhere beneath all his wounded pride, there remained at least a flicker of basic human decency. She had no time to dwell on it. She turned her wagon back toward the fire, toward Nathan, toward whatever chaos awaited her there. By the time Evelyn reached the Grant property, the scene that greeted her was one of controlled, desperate chaos. Nathan and a dozen other men worked in a frantic line, beating at the fire's advancing edge with wet sacking, digging fire breaks with shovels, hauling water from Mrs. Grant's well in a continuous, exhausting relay. The smoke hung thick and choking in the air, and somewhere beyond the line of fighting men, Evelyn could see Mrs. Grant's small house dangerously close to the fire's hungry reach. "Evelyn?" Nathan spotted her, his face streaked with soot and sweat, relief and alarm warring in his expression. "You shouldn't be this close." "Neither should you," Evelyn shot back, already climbing down and grabbing an empty water bucket. "Where's Mrs. Grant?" "Inside, gathering what she can carry, half out of her mind with fear, and I don't blame her." Nathan's jaw tightened. "The fire's close, Evelyn. Too close. If the wind shifts even slightly, that house is gone. Then we get her out, and we save what we can save," Evelyn said, already moving toward the small house at a run. She found Mrs. Grant inside, frozen in the middle of her kitchen, clutching a small wooden box to her chest, tears streaming down her soot-smudged face, utterly paralyzed by grief and terror. "Mrs. Grant." Evelyn took the older woman's shoulders firmly. "We need to move, now. What's most important to you in this house, tell me quickly, and we'll carry it out together." "My husband's things," Mrs. Grant sobbed. "The county records. I've been keeping the old land deeds for half this valley since the courthouse fire 10 years back. Everyone trusted me to hold on to them safe, and if they burn, then we save them," Evelyn said firmly, already moving toward the cabinet. Mrs. Grant gestured toward with shaking hands. "Show me where, quickly." Together, working with the frantic efficiency born of genuine terror, they gathered an entire cabinet's worth of irreplaceable documents, land deeds, property records, decades of the valley's legal history that existed nowhere else, bundling them into every available sack and blanket, carrying them out through smoke that grew thicker by the minute. "The wind's turning," someone shouted from outside, and Evelyn felt a fresh surge of terror at the sound of genuine panic in the voice. "Go," she told Mrs. Grant, pushing the last bundle of records into the older woman's arms. "Get to the wagon now, I'm right behind you." She grabbed one final armful of scattered papers from the kitchen table and turned just in time to see a curl of smoke seeping beneath the back door, faster and thicker than anything that had come before. Outside, the wind had indeed turned, driving the fire's edge suddenly and viciously toward the house with terrifying speed. And Nathan, catching sight of the shift, felt his heart seize with absolute terror. "Evelyn's still inside!" he shouted already, sprinting toward the house, ignoring every shouted warning from the men around him. He burst through the front door just as Evelyn emerged from the kitchen, her arms full of papers, coughing hard against the thickening smoke, her eyes streaming. "Nathan." "We need to go now," he said, grabbing her free hand and pulling her toward the door, just as a section of the roof above the kitchen caught with a sudden, terrible whoosh of flame. They burst out into the yard together, coughing, stumbling, the heat at their backs so fierce it felt like something alive chasing them. Nathan didn't stop pulling her forward until they'd cleared a safe distance, and only then did he turn to look at her, checking her over, with frantic, searching eyes. "Are you hurt? Evelyn, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she managed between coughs. "The records, Mrs. Grant's records, we got them, they're safe." "I don't care about the records," Nathan said, his voice cracking with an intensity that startled them both. "I care about you. I thought for a moment there, He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The raw terror still written across his face said everything his voice couldn't quite manage. "I'm here," Evelyn said softly, reaching up to touch his soot-streaked face with a trembling hand. "I'm right here, Nathan." Behind them, the house continued to burn, but the fire line held, the wind mercifully settling again after that one terrible gust, and slowly, painstakingly, the exhausted line of firefighters began to gain ground against the flames. By the time the sun set and the fire finally truly died, Mrs. Grant's house stood scorched and ruined, but every person who had come to fight the blaze stood alive, and the valley's precious land records, along with a dozen other small, irreplaceable treasures, had been saved. The days that followed the fire brought a shift in Cedar Ridge that no one, least of all Calvin Mercer, could have fully anticipated. Word spread quickly of everything that had happened, of Nathan leading the desperate fight against the flames, of Evelyn racing into a burning house to save records that mattered to the entire valley, of Calvin himself sending his own men to help, however grudgingly, when it truly counted. The whispers that had once painted Evelyn as a woman fleeing shameful secrets began slowly and unmistakably to shift into something else entirely. She ran into a burning house. Evelyn overheard one woman telling another outside the mercantile to save Mrs. Grant's records. "Nearly got caught by the flames herself, from what I hear." "And after everything Calvin said about her," the other woman replied, shaking her head. "Makes you wonder who the shameful one really is in all this." Evelyn said nothing. Simply continued on her way, but something in her chest loosened at the words, the first genuine sense since arriving in Cedar Ridge, that the truth might finally be strong enough to outrun the lies chasing it. But Calvin Mercer, watching his careful campaign of destruction crumble in the face of one dramatic afternoon of heroism, was not a man inclined to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, the shift in public sentiment only sharpened his desperation, and in the days that followed, that desperation would drive him toward a final, devastating act. One aimed not at ledgers or water rights or rumors, but directly at the one bond he had never expected to prove so difficult to break. Calvin found the ammunition he needed 3 days after the fire, and it came from a source no one expected. A traveling peddler passing through Cedar Ridge, the kind of man who collected gossip, the way other men collected debts mentioned offhand to anyone who'd buy a round of drinks, that he'd once passed through Evelyn's hometown in Ohio years back, and remembered a scandal attached to her family name, something about her father. Before his illness, losing a considerable sum of another man's money in a failed business venture. Calvin latched onto it like a starving man onto bread. He didn't bother verifying it. He didn't care whether it was true, half-true, or twisted beyond all recognition from whatever thin thread of fact it might have once contained. He simply took it, sharpened it into the cruelest shape he could manage, and brought it directly to the one place he knew it would do the most damage. The water rights hearing. The hearing was held in the largest room Cedar Ridge possessed, the meeting hall above the mercantile, packed wall to wall with nearly every rancher in the valley. The land commissioner seated at a long table at the front with an expression of weary neutrality that suggested he'd rather have been anywhere else. Nathan sat near the front with Evelyn beside him, her spine straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap, both of them braced for whatever Calvin intended to unleash. The early portion of the hearing proceeded as expected. Dry recitations of water rights history, surveyors' reports, testimony from ranchers on both sides regarding the drought's severity. Nathan's claim to the spring was old, well documented, and legally sound. And for a while, Evelyn allowed herself a small, cautious hope that perhaps reason and evidence would simply carry the day. Then Calvin rose to speak, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. "Commissioner, gentlemen," Calvin began, his voice carrying the practiced, reasonable tone of a man who wanted desperately to appear as though he had the valley's best interests at heart. "I don't dispute the paperwork on Walker's water right. I dispute whether a man ought to keep sole claim to a resource this valley desperately needs when circumstances have changed so dramatically since that right was first established." "That's not how water law works, Calvin, and you know it," Nathan said, rising to his feet. "Sit down, Walker. Let the man finish," the commissioner said tiredly. Calvin continued undeterred. "I raise this not out of any personal grievance, Commissioner, though I'll admit Mr. Walker and I have had our differences." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room at this understatement. "I raise it because I believe this valley deserves leadership with judgment we can trust, and I have serious concerns about Mr. Walker's judgment given who he's chosen to align himself with." Evelyn felt her stomach drop straight through the floor. "I don't see what that has to do with a water rights dispute," Nathan said, his voice going dangerously quiet. "Perhaps nothing," Calvin said smoothly. "Or perhaps everything if a man's judgment about who to trust with his ranch says something about his judgment generally. I've recently learned some troubling information about Miss Harper's family back in Ohio. Her father, it seems, wasn't quite the honest, hard-working man his daughter's letters made him out to be." "Don't," Evelyn said, rising to her feet before Nathan could, her voice cutting sharp through the murmuring crowd. "Don't you dare bring my father into this." "I'm afraid it's already been brought, Miss Harper," Calvin said, and there was real cruelty in his eyes, now unmasked. "Word has it your father lost another man's fortune in some failed venture before his illness. Word has it that's the real reason you left Ohio so eagerly, letters and advertisements notwithstanding, not because your father needed years of devoted care, but because there was nothing left for you there once his reputation collapsed." The room erupted into shocked murmuring. "That's a lie," Evelyn said, her voice shaking now, not with fear, but with a fury so complete it left her almost breathless. "My father was a good, honest man who worked as a bookkeeper his whole life. Whatever twisted rumor you've dug up—" "Can you prove it's twisted?" Calvin pressed. "Can anyone in this room verify a single thing about your family, Miss Harper, beyond your own word?" "We took Walker's word about those letters he claimed to write. Perhaps we ought to ask ourselves how many more convenient truths this couple has offered us since." The room had gone dangerously quiet, the kind of silence that precedes real damage, and Evelyn felt every eye in that hall settling on her with fresh suspicion, the careful trust built over the past weeks threatening to crumble beneath one man's calculated cruelty. She could have broken down. God knew she wanted to the exhaustion of defending herself again and again against baseless accusations threatened to overwhelm her completely in that moment. Instead, she felt something else rise up inside her, the same steel that had kept her upright in the middle of a humiliating street weeks before, the same stubborn refusal to let cruelty win simply because it shouted louder than truth. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice, though it trembled slightly, carried clearly across the silent hall. "I will not stand here and dignify secondhand gossip from a traveling peddler with a detailed defense. I could tell you my father's true history. I could produce his solicitor's letters confirming exactly what kind of man he was. But I suspect, knowing you as I've come to know you these past weeks, that no amount of proof would satisfy you, because proof was never truly what you were after. Then what am I after, Miss Harper? Calvin set his voice tight with barely controlled anger at being challenged so directly. You're after making yourself feel powerful again, Evelyn said, after the whole town watched you humiliate yourself by rejecting a woman for nothing more than the plainness of her traveling dress. You've spent weeks trying to destroy what Nathan and I have built, not because you care one bit about water rights or this valley's welfare, but because you cannot bear having been wrong in front of people whose respect you value more than your own decency. A murmur of surprised agreement moved through parts of the crowd, and Calvin's face darkened further. I don't need to listen to accusations from a woman with no proof of her own claims, he snapped. No, Evelyn agreed. You don't need to listen at all, but I'd ask everyone else in this room to consider something plainly before deciding whose word carries more weight here. Ask yourselves who arrived in this valley with nothing but 2 hands and an honest heart, and spent every day since giving whatever she had to whoever needed it. And ask yourselves who has spent that same time trying to tear down everything decent he could find simply because his pride couldn't survive one afternoon of public embarrassment. The silence that followed felt different this time, heavier with genuine consideration rather than scandalized shock. The land commissioner cleared his throat. Mr. Mercer, unless you have actual evidence to present regarding water rights rather than unverified personal accusations, I'm inclined to set aside the character questions entirely and rule strictly on the documentation before me. Calvin's jaw tightened, sensing the room slipping away from him. Commissioner, surely the character of the parties involved matters when... What matters, the commissioner said firmly, is 30 years of established water rights properly documented against a complaint that appears the longer I sit here increasingly personal rather than practical. I'm ruling in favor of Walker's existing rights. This hearing is adjourned. The room erupted into a mixture of murmured reactions, but Evelyn barely heard any of it, her attention fixed entirely on Calvin's face as it crumpled from fury into something that looked for just a moment almost like fear. The fear of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that his power in this valley might not be as absolute as he'd always assumed. Nathan and Evelyn walked out of that hearing together, the weight of victory settling over them slowly, cautiously, neither quite ready to trust it fully. You didn't have to defend yourself like that, Nathan said quietly, once they'd put some distance between themselves and the dispersing crowd. I know you would have, Evelyn said, but some fights, Nathan, a person has to win for themselves. I've spent my whole life letting other people's judgments decide who I was allowed to be. I wasn't about to let Calvin Mercer add one more voice to that chorus without answering him directly. Nathan looked at her with an expression of such open admiration that Evelyn felt her breath catch. I've never known anyone like you, he said softly. You wrote to someone like me for 6 months. Evelyn reminded him, a small smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. You just didn't know it was truly me you were falling in love with, rather than some idea of me. I think, Nathan said carefully. Somewhere along the way, it stopped mattering which came first. The letters or the woman. They both turned out to be exactly the same person. They stood together in the fading afternoon light. Something unspoken, but entirely understood passing between them, and for the first time since Evelyn had stepped off that stagecoach weeks before, she allowed herself to imagine a future in Cedar Ridge that didn't involve constantly defending her right to exist within it. That fragile peace lasted exactly 4 days. The second wildfire began differently than the first, not from careless accident, but from something far more deliberate, though it would take time for anyone to understand that distinction. It started at the edge of Nathan's own property, this time in dry brush near his northern fence line, at an hour when no cook fire should have been burning anywhere nearby. By the time Tommy spotted the smoke and raised the alarm, the fire had already gained a dangerous foothold, driven by the same relentless drought winds that had fed the first blaze. This one's on our land, Nathan said grimly, already moving to gather what tools and men he could. Started too clean, too sudden. Somebody set this fire deliberately. Calvin? Evelyn said the name coming out like a curse. I can't prove that, Nathan said. Not yet. Right now, I need to worry about stopping it before it reaches the herd or the barn or... He stopped himself before finishing that particular thought, but Evelyn understood exactly what he meant. The barn. The makeshift schoolroom. Everything they'd built together over the past weeks. This time the fight against the flames stretched deep into the night, exhausting every hand the ranch possessed, drawing help once again from neighboring properties, whose owners had in the wake of the hearing begun to see Nathan and Evelyn rather differently than Calvin's rumors had once painted them. Even Mrs. Grant arrived, her house still standing, half rebuilt from the first fire, bringing what water and blankets she could spare, refusing to let anyone talk her out of helping despite her own recent losses. "You saved my records," she told Evelyn fiercely, hauling a water bucket with far more strength than her age suggested she possessed. "I'm not about to stand by while your home burns." By the time the fire was finally beaten back in the gray hours just before dawn, exhaustion had hollowed out every person who'd fought it. But the barn stood. The herd remained safe, and Nathan's cabin had survived with only minor damage to one outbuilding. It was in the wreckage of that damaged outbuilding, sifting through the charred remains the following morning, that Tommy found something that changed everything. "Boss?" The boy said, his voice strange and tight, holding out a partially burned kerosene container that had clearly not belonged to Nathan's supplies. "This ain't ours. And look here." He pointed to markings burned into the metal, a brand mark Nathan recognized instantly. "That's Mercer's mark," Nathan said slowly, his blood running cold with a mixture of fury and vindication. "That's from Calvin's ranch." The proof once assembled was damning, almost beyond dispute. The kerosene container bearing Calvin's brand. A ranch hand from Calvin's property cornered by Nathan, with careful, patient questioning, who finally broke down and admitted, shaking with fear, that Calvin had ordered him to set the fire, promising a substantial bonus, and threatening dismissal if he refused. "He said it'd just scare you off the land," the young hand said miserably, unable to meet Nathan's eyes. "Said it wouldn't really hurt, nothing, just enough to make you think twice about staying. I didn't know it'd get so big, Mr. Walker. I swear I didn't mean for, but you did it anyway." Nathan said, his voice hard with barely controlled anger, knowing exactly what fire can do in a drought like this. The hand said nothing, his silence its own confession. Nathan brought the evidence directly to the county sheriff, along with the trembling, guilt-racked testimony of Calvin's own hired man. And within 2 days, Calvin Mercer found himself facing charges that no amount of money or standing could easily make disappear: arson and reckless endangerment of an entire valley already suffering under drought. The final unraveling, when it came swiftly. Facing formal charges abandoned by ranchers who had once deferred to his wealth and standing, but now recoiled from association with a man willing to burn his neighbor's land out of pure spite. Calvin Mercer's carefully built empire in Cedar Ridge collapsed within a matter of weeks. He sold his ranch at a considerable loss to cover his mounting legal troubles and quietly left the valley altogether before his trial date, never to be seen in Cedar Ridge again. "It's over," Nathan said, standing with Evelyn at the edge of his property, watching the last of the fire's scorched aftermath finally begin to show the first tender signs of new growth pushing up through blackened earth. "Really over." "Is it?" Evelyn asked softly. "Or does it just feel that way because we're both too exhausted to feel much of anything else right now?" Nathan laughed, a tired, genuine sound. "Maybe both." The drought broke 3 weeks later, arriving not with the dramatic fury of a single storm, but with a slow, steady rain that fell for 2 full days, soaking into the parched earth with a gentleness that felt to everyone in Cedar Ridge like something close to a blessing. Evelyn stood on the porch watching it fall, her face turned up toward the gray sky, feeling something inside her own chest finally beginning to ease after weeks of relentless tension. "You look happy," Nathan said, coming to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I am happy," Evelyn said, surprising herself with how simply and completely true the words felt. "I don't think I've said that honestly in longer than I can remember." 30 days, Nathan said quietly. "That's what you asked for when we first arrived here." 30 days to decide whether you could trust the man behind those letters. It's been considerably longer than 30 days now, Evelyn pointed out. It has, Nathan agreed. I noticed you never once mentioned leaving once that deadline passed. Evelyn turned to look at him, rain still falling steadily beyond the porch's shelter, and something in her expression made Nathan's heart skip several beats at once. I stopped counting days somewhere around the second week, she admitted quietly. Somewhere between the ledgers and Tommy's reading lessons and Mrs. Grant's letters to her son, I simply stopped thinking about leaving at all. Evelyn. Nathan's voice had gone rough with an emotion he no longer bothered trying to hide. I know we've been through more in these past weeks than most people go through in years. I know this isn't the courtship either of us imagined when we first started writing those letters. But I don't want to spend one more day pretending I don't know exactly what I want now that the drought's finally broken and Calvin's finally gone. What do you want, Nathan? Evelyn asked softly, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer and was simply waiting breathlessly to hear him say it. Nathan reached for her hand, holding it the same careful, reverent way he'd once held her traveling case in the middle of a humiliating street. I want to marry you, he said. Not because Calvin rejected you, and not because you have nowhere else to go, and not because of any of the circumstances that first brought us together. I want to marry you because somewhere in the middle of everything this valley has thrown at us, I fell completely, irreversibly in love with exactly who you are. Not who your letters made me imagine. Not who Calvin's rumors tried to make you into. But the real woman who ran into a burning house to save a stranger's records, and stood her ground in front of an entire hostile crowd, and taught two grown ranch hands to read without ever once making them feel ashamed for not knowing already. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, though this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of pure, uncomplicated joy. Yes, she whispered. Nathan Walker, yes, I'll marry you. The rain continued falling steadily around them, washing away the last traces of ash and drought and cruelty that had nearly destroyed everything they'd built, and in its place, something new and lasting had finally taken root. Not the fragile beginning of a stranger's arrangement, but the solid, hard-won foundation of a love that had survived every test a hostile world could throw against it. News of the engagement spread through Cedar Ridge faster than the fire ever had, but this time, the whispers that followed carried nothing but warmth. About time? Mrs. Callahan said, wrapping Evelyn in an unexpected embrace the very next morning at the Mercantile, the same woman who months before had avoided her eyes over counted change. I'll admit, Miss Harper, I judged you unfairly when Calvin first ran you off. I hope you'll forgive an old woman for believing gossip before she believed her own eyes. There's nothing to forgive, Evelyn said, and she meant it. We've all got things we regret from those early days. What matters is what we do once we know better. Word reached Mrs. Grant within the hour, and the widow arrived at the ranch that same afternoon, her eyes bright with tears before she'd even climbed down from her wagon. A wedding, she said, gripping Evelyn's hand so tightly it nearly hurt. Lord, child, after everything this valley has put you through, you deserve every bit of joy coming your way. Let me help. Let me do something. I haven't had reason to celebrate anything since my husband passed, and I find I've missed it terribly. I couldn't ask that of you. Evelyn started, but Mrs. Grant was already shaking her head fiercely. You didn't ask. I'm offering. There's a considerable difference, and I'd ask you to respect it. She smiled, the echo of Evelyn's own words from weeks before, landing with gentle, deliberate irony. Now, tell me what you're imagining, and let this old woman feel useful again. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation, unlike anything Evelyn had ever experienced. She had expected, given the modest circumstances of Nathan's ranch and the hardship the whole valley had just weathered, that whatever wedding they managed would be small and simple. She hadn't accounted for what an entire, grateful community could accomplish once given the chance. Tommy and Eli spent their evenings after full days of ranch work building simple wooden benches for the ceremony, refusing any payment beyond Evelyn's promise to keep teaching them their letters long after the wedding had passed. Wouldn't feel right, ma'am, Tommy said, sanding down a rough plank with fierce concentration. You taught me to read. Least I can do is build you someplace decent to say your vows." The families whose children still gathered each morning in Nathan's barn brought what small contributions they could manage, a length of fine lace one mother had saved from her own wedding decades before, offered without hesitation for Evelyn's dress. A jar of precious honey from another family's hives meant for the wedding feast. Small, humble gifts that carried Evelyn realized with an ache of gratitude she hadn't expected far more weight than anything money could have purchased. "I don't understand how I've earned all this," she confessed to Nathan one evening, surrounded by the accumulating evidence of the valley's generosity. 2 months ago, half these people wouldn't meet my eyes. 2 months ago, Nathan said gently. They didn't know you yet. Calvin made sure of that right from the first afternoon. But people aren't always as easily fooled as a man like Calvin hopes Evelyn. Given enough time, given enough chances to see the truth for themselves, most folks find their way to it eventually. And if Calvin had succeeded, if the water rights hearing had gone differently, if that second fire had taken the barn instead of sparing it, Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Then I suppose we'd have found some other way through it," he said. "Because whatever else has happened in this valley these past months, I've learned one thing beyond any doubt. You don't quit on what matters. Evelyn Harper, no matter how hard the fight gets. I don't intend to start now, and I don't believe you do either." It was during this same stretch of joyful preparation that one final unexpected complication arrived, not from Calvin, whose absence from the valley remained mercifully complete, but from a source far closer to Evelyn's own heart. A letter arrived from Ohio, this one addressed directly to Evelyn, rather than her father's solicitor, and the handwriting on the envelope made her breath catch the moment she recognized it. "It's from my Aunt Margaret," she told Nathan, staring at the envelope with an expression he couldn't quite read. "My father's younger sister. We haven't spoken in nearly 6 years. Not since she told my father in no uncertain terms that caring for him would ruin whatever chance I had left at a decent life. You never mentioned an aunt." "There wasn't much to mention," Evelyn said, a trace of old bitterness creeping into her voice. "She thought my father's illness was a burden I ought to have avoided rather than embraced. We disagreed rather permanently on the subject, and she made her feelings known before disappearing from my life entirely." She opened the letter with visibly trembling hands, and Nathan watched her expression shift through surprise, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like grief as she read. "What does she say?" he asked gently once she'd finished. "She says," Evelyn said slowly, that word of everything that happened here reached her somehow through a mutual acquaintance. The engagement, the wildfire, Calvin's accusations against my father, and how thoroughly they were proven false. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She says she's ashamed of how she treated us both all those years ago. She says watching from a distance, as I built a life worth admiring, even while she'd predicted nothing but ruin for me, forced her to confront exactly how wrong she'd been." "That's quite an admission," Nathan said carefully. "She's asked," Evelyn continued, her voice catching, "whether she might attend the wedding. She says she understands entirely if I refuse her. She says she wouldn't blame me a bit for wanting nothing more to do with her after everything." Nathan watched her carefully, giving her the space to work through the tangle of emotion playing across her face without pushing her toward any particular answer. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over in her hands. "I spent 4 years being told by nearly everyone who claimed to care about me that devoting myself to my father was a mistake, that I was wasting my life on an obligation I should have avoided. I carried that judgment with me every single day, Nathan, even after he passed, even after I crossed half a country trying to outrun it. And now, Evelyn said slowly, I find myself standing in a valley that once rejected me, just as completely watching that same valley learn to see me clearly instead. I suppose I understand better than I ever have before how much it can matter when someone finally admits they judged you unfairly." She folded the letter carefully. "I think I'd like her to come. Not because I've forgotten what she said all those years ago, but because I've learned this past summer that people can grow beyond their worst moments if given the chance and the honesty to do it properly. Then we'll send word she's welcome," Nathan said simply, and the gentle, unquestioning support in his voice settled something uncertain in Evelyn's chest that had been unsettled for longer than she'd realized. Aunt Margaret arrived in Cedar Ridge 4 days before the wedding, and the reunion, when it finally happened, carried none of the dramatic confrontation Evelyn had half expected and half braced herself against. Instead, the older woman simply stood on the ranch's front step, her traveling case at her feet, her face lined with an exhaustion that seemed to extend well beyond the journey itself, and said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me today, Evelyn. I only wanted the chance to say in person how deeply sorry I am. Your father deserved a sister who supported him through his illness, not one who abandoned him to judgment. And you deserved an aunt who celebrated your devotion instead of condemning it." Evelyn studied her for a long moment, feeling the old hurt and the new hard-won understanding sitting uneasily together in her chest. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "I won't pretend it doesn't still sting some of what you said all those years ago. But I've learned this summer that holding onto old wounds too tightly only gives them more power over you than they deserve. I'd rather spend what time we have building something better than spend it relitigating what's already past." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "That's more grace than I have any right to expect." "Perhaps," Evelyn said. "But it's the kind of grace I hope to build my whole marriage around starting this week. Seems only fitting to extend a little of it to family as well." The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, the kind of gentle, sun-warmed day that felt, after everything the valley had endured that summer, like a deliberate gift. Evelyn stood in the small room that had once been hers alone during those first uncertain 30 days. Now dressed in a simple gown, assembled from the valley's collective generosity. Mrs. Grant's lace at the collar, careful stitching from 3 different women who'd each contributed an evening's work. A modest string of pearls that had belonged to Nathan's own mother, offered by an elderly neighbor who'd kept them safe since her passing. "You look beautiful," Aunt Margaret said, adjusting the veil with careful, tender hands. "Your father would be so proud of you, Evelyn, not just of this day, but of everything you've built to arrive at it." "I wish he could see it," Evelyn said softly. "Perhaps he can," Margaret said. "I've come to believe these past difficult years that the people we love most never entirely leave us. They simply change the way they stay." Outside, the sound of a gathering crowd had begun to build, voices calling greetings, wagons arriving. Children's laughter carrying on the warm morning air. Evelyn moved to the window and looked out at the transformed ranch yard. Benches arranged in careful rows, wildflowers gathered by eager children, woven into simple arrangements along the aisle. Nearly the entire valley assembled to witness what had once seemed to nearly everyone present like an impossible outcome. She thought of that first terrible afternoon standing alone with her traveling case while an entire town watched Calvin reject her. She thought of the humiliation, the whispers, the crushing fear that she had crossed 2,000 miles, only to find herself once again unwanted, unworthy, alone. She could never have imagined standing in that dusty street that the same town would one day gather so completely, so warmly, to celebrate exactly the future that street had once seemed determined to deny her. Nathan waited at the front of the gathered crowd, dressed in his one good suit, his hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling, watching the small crowd with an anticipation that bordered on unbearable. Tommy stood beside him, having insisted on the honor of standing witness, his own reading skills now steady enough that he'd offered shyly to help read the vows aloud if either of them stumbled with nerves. "Never seen you this nervous, boss," Tommy whispered, grinning despite the solemnity of the occasion. "Not even when that bull got loose in the spring." "This is considerably more important than a loose bull, Tommy," Nathan murmured back, and the boy's quiet laugh helped ease some of the tension coiled tight in his chest. Then the small gathered crowd fell silent, and Nathan turned to see Evelyn appearing at the top of the porch steps, and every thought in his head simply emptied out entirely, replaced by nothing but the overwhelming, humbling reality of the woman walking toward him. She had never looked more like herself. He thought, Not dressed up beyond recognition, not transformed into someone unfamiliar for the occasion, but simply radiantly, unmistakably, Evelyn carrying herself with the same quiet dignity that had first caught his attention, buried in the pages of a stranger's letters. When she reached him, taking his offered hand, he found he could barely speak at all. "You're shaking," she whispered, a small, warm smile playing at her lips. "So are you," he whispered back. "Good," she said. "Means we're both taking this exactly as seriously as it deserves." The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by the circuit preacher who'd arrived the previous evening specifically for the occasion, but the vows Nathan and Evelyn had written for each other carried a weight that silenced the entire gathered crowd. "Evelyn," Nathan began, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly building beneath it. "I want you to know something before God and this whole valley. I fell in love with you before I ever saw your face hiding behind another man's name, writing words I told myself belonged to someone else. But every single one of those words was true, and every single one of them was mine. I loved your honesty before I loved your smile. I loved your strength before I ever witnessed it firsthand, running into a burning house, standing your ground against a man determined to destroy you. I promise you now what I couldn't promise you then, that from this day forward, every word I offer you will be entirely, unmistakably my own." Evelyn's eyes had filled with tears long before he finished, and when it came her turn to speak, her voice, though thick with emotion, carried clearly across the silent gathering. "Nathan," she said, "I crossed 2,000 miles believing I was traveling toward a stranger, and I discovered instead that I was traveling toward the truth. The plain, unglamorous, deeply honest truth that character matters more than any circumstance, that love built on honesty can survive nearly anything thrown against it. You saw me clearly on the worst day of my life, standing humiliated in the middle of a street, and you chose me anyway, not out of pity, but because you recognized something in me worth choosing. I promise you for as long as I live that I will meet that choice with equal honesty, equal courage, and a love every bit as steady as the one you first offered a stranger through paper and ink." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife to a crowd that had gone almost entirely silent, with emotion broken only by the sound of Mrs. Grant's unrestrained weeping and Tommy's badly disguised sniffling beside Nathan. The celebration that followed stretched long into the warm summer evening. Tables laden with contributions from nearly every family in the valley, music provided by two ranchers with fiddles who'd clearly practiced specifically for the occasion. Laughter and dancing carrying across the ranch yard, where just weeks before, wildfire had scorched the earth black. Evelyn found herself at one point during the celebration standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, watching Nathan laugh with Tommy and Eli, watching Mrs. Grant deep in animated conversation with Aunt Margaret, watching an entire community celebrating together the very relationship that had once been publicly humiliatingly rejected in the middle of Cedar Ridge's main street. "You look like you're thinking too hard for a wedding day," Nathan said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of Mrs. Grant's cider. "I'm thinking," Evelyn admitted, "about how differently this day could have gone if you hadn't stepped forward that first afternoon, if Calvin had simply let his lie stand unchallenged, if I'd gotten back on that stagecoach believing I truly wasn't wanted here. But none of that happened," Nathan said gently. "No," Evelyn agreed. "It didn't. And I find myself wondering, standing here now, whether it was truly circumstance that brought us together, or whether some things are simply meant to find each other eventually, however roundabout the path turns out to be." Nathan considered this for a moment, watching the celebration continue around them. Children chasing each other between the tables, neighbors embracing who'd once stood divided by Calvin's careful manipulation, an entire valley knit back together, stronger than the drought and the fire, and the cruelty had ever managed to tear it apart. "I don't know about fate," he said finally. "I only know that I wrote to a stranger for 6 months, never once asking for a photograph, never once caring about anything beyond the honesty in her words. And when that stranger finally arrived, rejected in the street by the very man I'd been writing to on his own behalf, something in me simply couldn't stay quiet any longer. Whatever you want to call that, Evelyn, I know it wasn't circumstance. It was recognition. I knew you somehow long before I ever should have been able to.
Chegyem.
Later that evening, once most of the celebration had wound down and the valley's families had begun the long journeys back to their own homes, Nathan led Evelyn away from the dwindling gathering to the edge of the property, to the same spot where weeks before they'd stood together watching scorched earth begin its slow recovery. Now in the fading evening light, that same earth showed unmistakable signs of new growth, tender green shoots pushing determinedly up through what had once been nothing but ash and devastation. I wanted you to see this, Nathan said quietly. Before the day ended completely, Evelyn looked out at the recovering land, feeling the full weight of everything it represented settle over her. Every hardship survived, every cruelty overcome, every fragile hope that had somehow, against considerable odds, taken root and grown into something lasting. It's beautiful, she said softly. It reminded me of you, Nathan admitted. The way you arrived in this valley rejected and humiliated, and instead of letting that destroy you, you simply kept growing anyway. Kept giving, kept teaching, kept fighting for what mattered, until the whole valley couldn't help but recognize what had been in front of them all along. Evelyn turned to face him, fully reaching up to touch his face the same way she had in the terrible smoke-filled aftermath of that first devastating fire. I read your letters, Nathan Walker, believing I was falling in love with a stranger's honest heart, she said. I never imagined that heart would turn out to belong to the very man brave enough to claim me, publicly fight for me relentlessly, and love me completely, long after any reasonable man might have walked away from all the trouble I brought with me. There was never any trouble worth walking away from, Nathan said firmly. Only a woman worth every single difficulty it took to finally truly deserve her. He reached into his coat pocket then and withdrew a familiar worn piece of paper, the very first letter Evelyn had ever written him, carefully preserved through every hardship of the summer. I want to read you something, he said, unfolding it with careful, reverent hands. Something you wrote to me before either of us knew how completely our lives were about to change. He read aloud, his voice thick with emotion, the words Evelyn herself had nearly forgotten writing all those months before. What I am looking for, if I am honest, is simply someone who will not flinch when I tell the truth about who I am. He lowered the letter, meeting her eyes directly. I didn't flinch, Evelyn. Not that first day in the street, not through the water rights hearing, not through either fire, not through any lie Calvin tried to bury us beneath. And I promise you now, standing here as your husband, that I never will. Evelyn's tears fell freely now, but they carried none of the old grief, none of the old humiliation that had once defined so much of her journey to this valley. You were the first person who believed my heart before judging my face, she whispered. I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you found the courage to say so in front of everyone who doubted us both. Months later, as autumn settled gently over the valley and the ranch prospered under both their combined efforts, word occasionally drifted back to Cedar Ridge regarding Calvin Mercer's fate, a failed venture in a distant territory, a reputation that had followed him even beyond the valley he'd once ruled through fear and wealth. A man whose cruelty had finally inevitably cost him everything he'd once valued most. Evelyn heard the news without satisfaction and without pity, simply a quiet acknowledgement that some choices carry their own consequences, regardless of how much power a person believes protects them from reckoning. She thought instead, far more often, of everything the valley had built in the aftermath of his departure, the schoolhouse that had grown from a makeshift barn classroom into a proper building, the whole community had constructed together, staffed now by Evelyn herself, alongside a second teacher hired to help manage the growing number of eager students. The steady, prosperous rhythm of Nathan's ranch no longer threatened by drought or malice, but flourishing under the combined efforts of two people who had learned through considerable hardship exactly how much stronger they were together than either had ever managed alone. She thought of Tommy and Eli, both reading now with genuine confidence. Tommy having recently expressed a shy interest in perhaps attending a proper school himself someday, to become, as he put it, someone folks might trust to keep their books honest, same as you taught me. She thought of Mrs. Grant, her house fully rebuilt now with help from the whole valley, her loneliness eased by regular visits, and a community that had learned through fire and hardship exactly how much they needed one another. And she thought most often of all of that terrible, humiliating afternoon when she'd stood alone in the middle of Cedar Ridge's dusty street, rejected and ashamed, believing she had crossed an entire continent, only to arrive at nothing but further proof of her own unworthiness. She understood now with complete and unshakable clarity exactly how wrong that fear had been. Real love, she had learned through every trial that difficult summer had thrown against her, was never about first impressions, or surface judgments, or the shallow standards men like Calvin Mercer used to measure a person's worth. Real love was built patiently, through honest letters and honest labor, through standing firm against cruelty, and choosing again and again to show up fully for the people and the community that needed you most. The woman who had once been rejected by an entire town had become, through nothing more extraordinary than consistent honesty and unwavering courage, the most respected and beloved wife in all of Cedar Ridge. And Nathan Walker, watching his wife each evening as she graded her students' careful handwriting by lamplight, or organized aid for whichever family faced hardship, that particular season understood completely that the greatest fortune of his entire life had never been his land, his cattle, or his modest ranch. It had been the simple, unshakable truth that love built on honesty, tested by fire and drought, and every cruelty a jealous man could conjure, does not merely survive such trials. It emerges from them unbreakable, exactly as it was always meant to be.